You ready?
Yep, I'm ready to go.
All right. Um, in an effort to keep this accessible, I guess, to anyone who comes across it, right? I suppose it's helpful as we go to try and define things and lay out ideas and whatever. So, I wanted to touch a little bit on the view of modality that you like, and I've seen people call it now branching actualism. So going forward, I guess, is it all right if we call it BA maybe?
Yeah, I don't mind. I
All right.
probably I prefer not to use acronyms, so I'll probably just call it my view or something like that. But yeah,
That's fine. Yep.
that'd be fine.
So the idea then, I guess, to get started is um, the way we should think about possible worlds on this view is like all possible worlds are going to share a history with the actual world, and where we end up with a possible world is where chances play out, I guess. So we can think, just to make it simple, that we have some sort of starting point, right? Some sort of naturalist singularity or whatever. And as you go, you might have quantum events, say, that play out in a chancy way, and those are going to be possible worlds, right? Where it goes one way or the other, and those are going to be our possible worlds. That's kind of the gist, at least.
Right. So if you think of a world as a complete history um, from the beginning point, and then if there's an end point to the end point, or if there's no end point all the way, so each possible path that you can run along will be a world. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess as I've thought about it, there were a couple of things that I guess I wanted to kind of clarify. So um, think about like the laws of nature, right? If they're kind of set at like T1, right, in our kind of first point in
Yeah.
time, right? If they're just there forever and they never change, they obtain of necessity at that point because they're going to be there in all possible worlds, right?
Yeah.
So is it possible that they turn out to be chancy though? Like if we have, I don't know, some sort of like big crunch, and then it turns out that our laws could have been any which way or whatever. I don't know. Is it possible that they turn out to be chancy?
So I'm not sure how they exactly what you've got in mind. Could the laws change? I suppose. Could they just could we have certain laws up to a certain point and then different laws thereafter? Um, I guess I so I'm not really a big fan of laws anyway. I'd rather talk about causal powers. Could the causal powers of things suddenly swap so that um, it seems unlikely to me that that would be an attractive view. So I guess I'm inclined to think that the laws are necessary and there's nothing chancy about them on this view. Right. I mean, obviously, it's a controversial view about modality, but it seems to me the best version of the view is just going to say, well, no, the laws are necessary.
Yeah. So I guess that's kind of the way that you would want to think about it. I guess what I was sort of getting at is like, and I don't know if this is like a plausible view of physics. Almost certainly not, actually. I don't know anything about physics really, but it's like, suppose we have a big crunch before this one, right? In like a series of kind of big crunches, big bangs, right? Um, and in each new big bang or whatever, right? We just have like a generator for the laws, right? And I'm not saying that's even like plausible, but even if it's sort of conceivable, and so we kind of grant it possibility just on conceivability, right? Could it turn out on something like that the laws turn out to be kind of chancy or whatever?
Okay, so so this is interesting. I was thinking about a single run. So you said there's an origin point, right? We could imagine that there's a series of expansions and contractions, and that our Big Bang is not actually an origin point because there can be an infinite past of these things, right, going forwards to the future. But then I don't think that the laws, the way that I'm thinking about laws, will be the things that govern some part of this. The laws will be the things that govern the whole lot. And so they will still turn out to be necessary, I think. Maybe there's a question here about what it takes for something to be a law, but I'm thinking of the laws as whatever. If we're going to talk about the laws governing, they're going to govern all of reality. Right? Then it's not clear that they'll be chancy either. But I guess it depends a bit what you think happens each time there's a crunch and a new expansion. Some things will change. So, for example, maybe entropy will be reset, to take one example.
But on kind of your preferred view, though, the law that says that entropy is always going to increase is always going to be there, right? That's never going to. That's kind of necessary over all of reality. That's not going to change in any of the runs on.
Right. So if there's thermodynamic laws, it'll be universal. Yes. Okay. I guess when I've been thinking about this, I've deliberately ignored questions about the kind of cyclic views. I haven't ignored the possibility that there might be a multiverse and you might actually have some laws that govern the multiverse. So I'm not sure. I think what I really want to do is split the view into two parts and say, this is what you say if there's a single shot. This is what you say if there's cycling. And the things that I've said about the necessity of the laws definitely apply to the single shot view. And I would need to think about what to say about the cycling view. I don't think that there's particularly much evidence for the cycling view. And I'm not sure that the thinking about the cycling view is of all that much additional interest in the main case that I'm interested in, which is trying to kind of compare decent naturalistic views with decent theistic views. If anything, the cycling view seems to make things harder for theism, at least slightly. If you want to have, if you allow that there's an infinite past and you want God to be creator and sustainer, it's hard to get that to come out because at every point in the past, God's got to be doing some sustaining work, bringing about the next bit. But if that goes back infinitely far, that's kind of, I think that's slightly awkward.
Yeah, I suppose it is. Yeah, and it's not. I think you might be right to say that it's not super important, at least not in the way that you're thinking about it. It was just kind of like, I don't know, trying to flesh out a detail, I guess, just for my curiosity. There is, I think that something a lot of people are going to ask, though, especially if they're theists, right? They're going to want to know, like, on the single shot view, right? It sort of falls out of the view, I guess, at that point, that if you have these laws at the initial point or whatever, they turn out to be necessary. They're going to be there in every possible world. But I guess there's still this like itch, right? Like why is the initial point the way that it is,
Right, and the answer to that is because it has to be, and stop asking me questions at this point because what's necessary, once you've hit necessity, you've reached rock bottom. There's no explaining why necessary things are necessary. There's no explaining their necessity. There's why they are the way they are is explained in terms of their necessity, but why they're necessary, that's something you're not going to get an explanation for. And we're kind of familiar with this in the theistic view on what's the line that most theists these days take. So God's necessary. So, right, that's a stopping point. There's no explaining why God's necessary. Well, I mean, there's one or two people, maybe Brian Lefto's tries to tell you a story about that, but most people don't find that convincing, and most people just sort of think that's where the conversation ends. So I'm thinking that what's fine for theists is fine for naturalists at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, in general, I mean, unless you want to go down a regress forever, it kind of seems like explanations have to end somewhere, no matter how you're thinking about it. I mean, the explanation's going to terminate somewhere, you know?
And so then there's this question. So where do we terminate? Brute contingency or brute necessity, right? We're terminating somewhere, so something's brute, something's going unexplained. I'm inclined to lean a little bit towards the terminating in necessities, but I don't really care which way it goes, right? I mean, if it turned out that someone could persuade me that the better view was to think you just stop with brute contingencies, then I'd happily adopt that. It just would mean that God would be, I mean, the best versions of theism would say that God's a brute contingency, right? That's just how it would play out.
Yeah. Um, so I have been thinking too, and this is again not of any import, I don't think, to the way that you want to think about it, but just trying to flesh out a detail. If I'm a theist, right? If I put on my theist hat and I say, look, all of the right, you have your kind of naturalist initial point, right, and I have my theistic one, right. I think for you, theism turns out to be impossible just because of everything that you believe, right? But if I wanted to put on, my theist hat and say, look, God is kind of the initial point in all of my possible worlds, right? And so he turns out to be necessary. Is that compatible with, the view of modality that you like?
Yeah, sure. So I think that that necessitarian theists have this view, right? Every possible world starts with God. And now, how do you get different worlds out of this? I think that it's going to be because either there's just brute contingency in God, or else God's creative act is indeterministic, and all kinds of things can come out of it, right? There's different ways of playing this, but it's going to look very similar to the naturalistic view, right? So anyway, that's what I think.
Yeah. So this one I think is going to be pretty important to the way that you want to think about it. But there's so in general, right? You want to kind of compare, kind of idealized naturalist theories to idealized theistic or really whatever. But in
Yeah.
philosophy of religion, it's going to be theism. So you want to compare, the best possible theory to the best possible theory, and it turns out, pretty much no matter how you go, you reckon that naturalism comes out looking a little bit simpler. Um, I guess I'm wondering, if there have been any attempts or if there's much hope, by your lights at least, that maybe there's some kind of symmetry breaker. Like if you want to say, look, if you're a necessitarian, I'm a necessitarian, we compare those, and it turns out that my theory looks a little bit, I'm saving on some costs, right? Is there some sort of attempts to say, no, look, if you're a naturalist, you just don't get to be a necessitarian, right? Only theism is compatible with this, or something like that.
Well, you can try saying that, but I don't see how you can defend it.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, there are people who think that, I don't know, maybe it's a sort of proprietary right. The first people who had this kind of view were theists, so they own the view and no one else can have it. But that's not the right way to think about things. We're interested in what's the best theory, and it seems like you can just I mean, lots of people have balked at the idea of a necessary God over time. It has become quite widespread amongst theists now, but that wasn't always the case. It seems very weird that there could be a necessary person, for example. Why is a necessary? I mean, I'm going to assume just for this little bit that the theists are people who take seriously the idea that God's a person. So we're not talking about Thomists, for example. Right? So they take seriously the idea that God's a person. Necessary person sounds to lots of people, no better or worse than a necessary initial singularity.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. I was just wondering if maybe there were even attempts in the literature, or if pretty much everyone agrees that this is just not something worth even trying.
Well, it's certainly worth trying, whatever point of view, because, I mean, you can do this on either side, right? You can try arguing that actually a necessary singularity is much better than a necessary person, right? You can imagine that the symmetry could be broken either way. I'm kind of skeptical, and I haven't come across lots of people who think they know how to do this, but I wouldn't discourage people from exploring it. It's like almost everything in philosophy always turns out to be open ended. There's more to think about. Right? And so maybe there's some way of breaking the symmetry. Um, I'm inclined to think that's implausible, but that might just be me.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I guess like as far as you're aware, though, I mean, there's has anyone like I don't know tried it? You know, like have there been attempts?
So I think not really. I don't. I'm not. I bet maybe I'm forgetting stuff. I've by now in my career I've read an awful lot. And I don't have perfect recall. I don't recall reading anything that I thought made even a kind of prima facie plausible case for breaking this particular symmetry.
Okay. Um. So there was and I'm not sure that this is really important either to the way that you want to think about things, just another kind of fleshing out of a detail here. But I guess I was wondering how much modal knowledge we end up on this view, right? So I was thinking about it, and at first I thought maybe we don't have that much, but the more I thought about it, the more it seems like actually we have a lot, right? Because if we have an account of worlds, on a single shot run at least, right? If we know that certain things are going to be necessary, and then we know that the possible worlds are things that are going to be chances playing out, we actually have a lot of modal knowledge, right? Because it's like things that sort of don't follow the laws or whatever, even if you can conceive of them, they're just going to turn out to be impossible. Given the view, right? So it turns out that we actually know a lot of things in modal space.
So long as you know enough about the initial conditions and what the chancy things are, I guess. One thing to say is that um, there's we're still going to talk about something like conceivability, and that's another kind of modality. Right. I mean, necessity is one kind of modality, conceivability is another. And you're going to need something like that in order to do the kind of talk about worldview comparison, because at least in the kind of case that we're imagining here, um, once people disagree about necessities, they think of worldviews that reject the necessities that you go for are just impossible by your lights. But that doesn't take them off the table from discussion, because we can still talk about conceivability. It's just that that's got nothing to do with metaphysics, right? The metaphysics of the world. It's a point about theory choice.
Yeah. Hmm. I'll have to. That's interesting. I'll have to think about that a little bit. There have been times when you've gotten an opportunity a little bit to talk about your view about philosophy of mind. I wanted to flesh it out a little bit because I guess in my opinion the time that you've kind of spent talking about it is pretty limited. It's usually come up in other discussions. Like I saw something you had a little bit of time to talk about it in a video where you're talking about your article about arguments from reason. Um, but I really wanted to flesh that out a little bit. In my opinion, you haven't really gotten enough time to talk about it. So I wanted to kind of delve into that a little bit. So, you're an identity theorist, right?
Yeah. So the view that I've got is pretty similar to the view that Smart and Armstrong and Place had in the late 50s. There's a lot of stuff that happened, critical discussion of that view, charging off in all kinds of directions subsequently. And for a long time, I guess I wasn't entirely sure that it was the best view to hold, but I've come around to the view recently, like in the last decade or so, that actually the position that Smart had all those years ago is more or less right. I mean, there were things that happened, like he wasn't very clear on distinctions between what's a priori and what's necessary and what's analytic, and he wasn't very clear about some other matters. And some people thought that these other kinds of considerations just show that the kind of identity theory was indefensible. But I think that that was just a mistake. It was due to other limitations in the views of the people defending the identity theory, but it was nothing wrong with the identity theory itself. The version of the identity theory that I like most is probably pretty close to Lewis's, the one that he gives in Mad Pain and Martian Pain. So it's a kind of restricted type version. What a particular, you know, what it is for me to believe that snow is white, for example. Think of that as, and we'll think about that as a kind of a current belief rather than a dispositional one. So if I'm kind of got it before I'm right now sort of affirming to myself that snow is white, what's going on in me is very similar to what will be going on in any other human being who's affirming that. Won't necessarily be very similar to what's going on in an android or a Martian who's doing it. So that's why it's a kind of restricted type view. But for humans, there's we can think of the various different kinds of mental states, processes, and so on as just being neural states, processes, and so on. Of course, there's no question of matching them up. We don't know enough about the brain. We don't know enough about neural functioning. We're nowhere close to being able to say, when you're believing this, look, there's this stuff happening involving these neurons, and well, we aren't anywhere near that point. But in principle, the idea is there's nothing more to believing, perceiving, emoting, and all these other kinds of things than having certain kinds of stuff happening, occurring, being in your brain.
Right.
That's the view.
So you touched on something very briefly there, about, there's different ways that Martians could do it or whatever.
Yeah.
Because that kind of thing is kind of, I guess, as far as I understand, kind of the death knell, right, of like standard identity theory, right? Because that's you have this idea about multiple realizability, right? So the idea is like, if you're trying to say that some physical state is equivalent to some mental state, and they can be, multiply realized, that kind
Yeah.
of just does away with the idea.
Yeah. So I think not, for the reasons that Lewis gave in that paper. So what it is, I mean, the kind of locution that you need is something like this. What it is for you to be perceiving, believing, whatever it is just for certain stuff to be happening in your brain. What it is for the Martian is for certain stuff to be happening in them. But, I'm not going to, maybe Martians have hydraulic brains or something, to use one of Lewis's examples. There's nothing about that view that seems problematic from the standpoint of what's called multiple realizability, I don't think.
Yeah. And that, when I put on my identity theorist hat, that's pretty much what I think too. It's like, yeah, that's exactly what I would say too. I guess the reason it's sort of, I don't know, it seems like it sort of does away with like a really strong version maybe of identity theory. If you want to say that, mental states only have exactly one physical correlate, yeah, like sure, that probably does away with that. But if you want to weaken it a little bit, I guess I don't really see the issue either.
Right, so it's called a restricted type identity theory. It's not as weak as, so, Davidson's token identity theory. It's stronger than that, but it's not as strong as the view that you were just worrying about, one which seems like you don't want to accept, right?
Yeah. So this is going to tie into, I mentioned earlier your article about arguments from reason, and you got a little bit of time to talk about. I think it was Haldane, um, but he's got this idea that if you, I think we're borrowing from Lewis here when we say motion of atoms, right? He's got this idea that like if you think about things as just motions of atoms, right? Everything that goes on is just atoms moving
Yeah.
around or whatever. Um, then it's not really clear how you get consciousness, right? And you develop this idea about if you distinguish between different scales of kind of reality, it's
Yeah.
not really mysterious anymore, right? If you're looking on the level of atoms and quarks and whatever, yeah, you're never going to find anything, but clearly there's a kind of different level where we're at, where we're not just looking at atoms and quarks and whatever, right?
No, we're looking at brains, right? For example,
Yeah,
something that exists on this scale, the scale that
I
we
guess the
exist on. I
worry
mean,
is going to be like, aren't brains just kind of made up of those things, though?
right. So this is something that I've been writing more about recently. So um, uh, I think that it's been very common for people who are physicalists or whatever to be microphysicalists and think that what happens at higher scales is fully determined by what's happening at lower scales. And I've come to think that we don't really have any reason to accept that, right? Um, just to take a kind of really prosaic example, suppose I'm walking along, right, and then think about um, atoms inside my leg. They go where my leg goes, right? And equally, my leg goes where the atom goes. There's a kind of symmetry here, and there's no obvious reason to prefer um, a kind of top down or bottom up explanation, view about what's going on. Right. So it's very common for people to talk for people to talk about emergence, right, and say things like, well, consciousness has to be emergent relative to the atoms in the void, something like that. Um, but actually, it seems to me that emergence just builds in this idea that there's a direction that goes from the kind of small to the big, and we don't actually have very good reason to incorporate that into our metaphysics. That's what I think. Now, what this means, if you think about the kind of evolution of the universe over time, so think about the evolution of the universe over time and think about what's happening on different scales, there's a kind of things move together, right, in the way that I just described with respect to my leg and the atoms. But we don't have a science that describes the way that the things move together on the different scales as the universe evolves. Right now, maybe that's because you can't do that. Maybe you can only, whenever you're investigating the universe, you have to investigate it at a particular scale, and we don't have, and there's not going to be any very nice way of putting the bits together. I'm not sure, but at any rate, I don't, as you can see from what I've been saying, I don't have kind of fully worked out ideas about this, but I've, as I said, I'm not inclined to accept the kind of micro to macro reductionism
Yeah.
that's very common, and very common not just amongst physicalists, but amongst their opponents too.
So that's really interesting. I mean, I guess I'd never even considered that it could be any different. But the thought that crosses my mind is like, if you think about how, like, once you have a leg, right, I can kind of see where we're going here. But I guess the thought that crosses my mind is like, how did we get there in the first place, right? And it kind of seems like you're going to have to go top to bottom at that
So,
point.
so that's because if you wind the clock back far enough, the universe was very small, right? I mean, if you think about kind of 10 to the minus 40 seconds after the Big Bang, the universe is not very big at all, and you have to, in order for there to be things on larger scales, things of certain kinds on larger scales, there has to be sufficient passage of time in the evolution of the universe. So, for example, you just can't have carbon-based organisms until you're quite a long way, many hundreds of millions of years into the life of the universe, because you need third generation stars in order to have generated the carbon that you need in order to have the carbon based organisms, right? So there's going to be a very long period where you're just not going to see organisms anywhere, right? I mean, there's particular scales where you can see them, but those scales you won't have them for a certain point. And so it's fine to talk about, if you want to, emergence in this sense, right? Things can't appear in the universe until a certain amount of time has elapsed, because the universe has to be big enough and various other things have to have happened. But that's a different sense of emergence from the one which kind of suggests that that sorry that that's a different idea from the idea of determination, that what's happening at the higher scales is fully determined by what's happening at the lower scales right now. It's not a sort of cross-temporal thing. It's a at a time thing. And that's the one that I'm skeptical about.
So, hmm. I guess the thought is still just like, I don't know, maybe it ends up being a little bit redundant though, right? I mean, if you need the if you need the bottom up explanations long enough to develop the kind of top down, I don't know, maybe it seems a little bit superfluous at that point, you know?
Well, so it's not quite like that. It's just the universe has to get big enough, right? When the universe is smaller than a mouse, there can't be mice, right? The universe has to be, and in fact, you need quite a lot of space for there to be mice, because you need environments for them to live in and so on. So there's a, but you don't even have the scale, right? When the universe is very small, it's not on a scale where there can be galaxies, for example. You have to wait a long time before the universe is on a scale where you can have galaxies. I mean, maybe that's a better example to use than the example about an organism. That's just a different kind of consideration, right? So as the universe gets bigger, new scales open up. Right? If you think about the different scales, if you go and look at standard accounts of scale, there's like 15 or 16 different scales that seem significant. I guess to us, they're kind of between the thousandth of a meter and 100 meters. That sort of is a single scale. That's the one that's kind of most significant to humans, though, planetary scale is also important, and solar system, stellar system goes up, and going down, there's sort of molecular scale, atomic scale, subatomic, quarks and electrons, and who knows below that.
Yeah. Um It is interesting. I guess I don't know, the worry that I've still sort of got is like, to bring it back to your leg, right? Your leg is made out of more fundamental stuff, right? And it's like,
Well, is it more fundamental? That's part of because what do you mean by more fundamental here?
I guess I'm
Um,
thinking, kind of particles, right? Whatever goes into it, right? Atoms or whatever.
so, so you might. So here's something. Well, I don't know whether I want to muddy the waters with this or not, but um, you said made out of stuff, and you might take that seriously, right? What's your leg made from? Well, it's fleshy. It's made from flesh. And in kind of common sense, we think of that flesh as a kind of continuous thing that's filling space, right? It's true that we also think that if we probed it, we would find out that actually the flesh is made up of cells, right? Things of a certain kind. And then we'll think of the cells as being made up of stuff. I forget what the right term is for the celly stuff, but and then in turn we'll think of that as being made up at some lower level, and so we sort of naturally think that there is this kind of leveling in reality of things and stuff. So things are made up of stuff, and then the stuff's made up of things, and so on. And there's a question about whether intuitively we think that if you've got one of these sort of thing, stuff, thing hierarchies, that the things at the lower level are parts of the thing at the top. Because we might think that things have to have kind of functions that are evident at the level of the whatever it is we're talking about. And it's not clear that we think of, I mean, to take an extreme example, that we think of the electrons that are part of your body as being kind of functional contributors to the functioning of you, the human organism. So, so I think that sort of folk metaphysics is not obviously committed to the idea that you've got parts at the, thing parts at lower levels. Right. Now, I really don't know what to make of this. I've been thinking about this quite a lot recently. And you might think, well, this is just folk metaphysics, all right? It's not something that you should take very seriously. But I'm not sure. So this is, I mean, given that we've started talking about weird things I've been thinking about, there's something else that I've been thinking about.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it just seems sort of enormously complicated too. I guess I don't even know. I don't know personally how I would even begin to sort out some of the details here. Um, yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, I guess we'll both keep thinking about it. Um, so there's another kind of like stock objection, I guess, to identity theories, right? Where they're going to invoke Leibniz's law, right? Where for something to be kind of identical with something else, it has to have basically exactly the same
Yeah,
kind of properties. And so it just seems to most people like if you want to say that some physical state and some mental state are basically the same thing, right? That just doesn't seem quite right to most people. If you show people I don't know. It's like an old sort of bad example, right? But like C fiber stimulation being
yeah,
pain or whatever, right? The kind of classic bad example. It just seems to most people like if you show them a picture of a C fiber being stimulated, they're just going to be like, that just doesn't seem like pain to me. Those just seem
right.
like they have different properties.
So, so, I, so I'm not sure what to say to that, right? So suppose that what I said is right, then you're having certain things happening in your brain. I mean, I'll think about a process, certain things going on in your brain. Just will be your perceiving, thinking, and so on. And for some of those things, there'll be something that it's like to be a creature that's having those things going on in you. And so if that story about C fibers firing was correct, right, that old pseudo scientific one, right? Um, if it was true that your being in pain is just a matter of your C fibers firing, there would be something that it's like to have your C fibers firing, to be a creature in which your C fibers are firing, and lo and behold, it would be feeling pain, right? So, so I really don't see that there's a kind of Leibniz law problem here. And of course, you can be mistaken. You can think there are two things where there are one, just like people thought there was Hesperus and there was phosphorus and they were different things, right? That doesn't show that there isn't just one thing, right? And that would be the same thing that would be going on here, right? You look in someone else's head, or you've got the cerebroscope and you look inside your own head at your C fibers, and then you're feeling this pain, and there's this stuff happening in the C fibers. It can be perfectly intelligible that there's just one thing here, even though you're making the mistake of thinking that there are two.
Yeah. So I guess there's sort of a more sophisticated version of the same idea where, um, if you have some sort of emotional state or mental state, right? Like if you're in a state of anger, right? You're probably angry about something, right? Your state is about something. But if it's like, the idea is going to be if you have some sort of physical state that's supposed to be kind of correlating with that, it's not obvious that the physical state is really about anything.
Right. So, and it's not supposed to be correlated, it's supposed to be the same state. And all that's going to follow from this is that certain kinds of neural states have representational properties, right? That's all that's going to follow. And that doesn't seem particularly surprising. The dog latches onto the rabbit and chases the rabbit around. It's kind of irresistible to think that the dog's in some kind that there's perceiving of the dog going on, so perceiving of the rabbit going on in the dog, and that perceiving is about the rabbit. Right? It doesn't, and we can drive this pretty far down. I mean, I don't think that dogs are kind of at the lowest level where there are creatures with representational states.
Yeah.
I know it's true that in the history of philosophy, there have been people who've just outright denied this, who've said that the only things that have representational states are humans, and that chimpanzees are just like automata. I find that completely incredible.
Yeah, yeah. I would completely agree with you there. I guess it might help to kind of go over the idea of like a representation, right? So when we're saying that it's not surprising that certain physical states are going to have representational properties, I guess what does that mean?
Well, I, I'm going to cheat and do say this stuff, assuming the identity theory is right.
Right.
Right. We think of mental states as having representational properties. So I have thoughts about Brazil, for example. Right. What is my thinking about Brazil? Well, that's some stuff that's happening in my brain, some kind of neural stuff, neural process. So whichever one it is, that has the property of being as representing Brazil as being a certain way, whatever.
Right.
I just don't see the difficulty here. Right?
Yeah, in that particular case, it doesn't strike me as problematic either. I don't know, something about like emotions specifically kind of drives a wedge in it for me for some reason. My brain is just like, I don't know about that because it's I don't know why, because I don't think there's a principle difference, really.
So, so maybe it's because emotion isn't just neural. Maybe because I mean, there's this thought that maybe we need to go bigger. More of the organism needs to be involved, and there's definitely other physical stuff that's involved in emotions. Stuff to do with your face, and I mean, get red with anger, white with fear, and so on. So it has to do, I assume, with blood flow and all kinds of other things as well. I'm quite happy for the state to be bigger. I mean, for it not always to be merely neural, though I think neural is obviously involved in emotional states. Right. I mean, does that help?
Maybe. I think it's something I'll just have to kind of sit back and think about for a bit. Um, because I don't have some sort of like principled reason for thinking that one is problematic and one isn't. It's just kind of when you say it, my brain is just doesn't like it for some reason. Um, so I guess to not just if I just sit here and think, that's not going anywhere. So there's also, I guess, noting there's about 10 minutes, give or take, before this is going to just sort of shut off automatically and I'll have to, restart. But um, there's this idea, I guess, in theistic circles lately, right, about psychophysical harmony. Um, I guess I was wondering if you had seen anything about it and kind of what you thought about it.
Right. So you can guess what I think. And indeed, started rethinking about a lot of these things when I read the paper by whoever it is, Crummett and somebody, I think. I can't remember who the other author was. Um, and it seems to me that, I mean, at least in the kind of the version of the paper that I saw, that they just ignored the identity theory. I mean, maybe this was a fairly early draft, but they just assumed that the identity theory is mistaken because there's no mysterious harmony if you're an identity theorist.
Yeah, I guess that's true, right? It's kind of just necessarily the case that,
Yeah,
yeah, I guess that's true. It
right. I
just
mean,
is kind of assumed that it's
and
false.
it seemed to me that that was kind of the nicest solution here, right? Because it's kind of weird having having all this stuff happening in the brain, this incredibly delicate and complicated instrument, and then thinking that there's this independent stuff um, that's somehow marching in step with what's happening in the brain. There's this correlation, but then it's really hard to explain why there's this correlation and how it came about and so on. Um, it looks to me like every other view is going to be disadvantaged relative to the identity theory here.
Yeah, because if you're an identity theorist, you would want to say that these the mental and the physical being identical. That's a necessary relation, right? So
Yeah,
there's no it's not mysterious because it's necessary,
yeah, that's correct.
right? Okay.
And some people find it hard to come at the idea that when there's some mentation going on, when they're feeling or thinking or whatever, that what's happening is that there's this stuff going on in their brain that just is that mentation. But it seems a very natural view to me, a very natural view to take.
Yeah.
And it
Yeah.
has these advantages of simplicity and so on, right?
Yeah. I think David Papineau's written a lot about people's dualist intuitions because they are kind of deeply rooted, right? I mean, we all, even if we sort of outgrow them, I feel like probably you and I both had those intuitions at one point. They are just kind of there for most people. It seems like.
So I guess that's right. I mean, I don't know that I ever had them, but maybe I did. It's hard to remember
Yeah,
far enough back.
I
Um,
suppose. Yeah, I guess I don't find them. I don't have those intuitions anymore. But when you first start thinking about it, I guess when I first did several years ago, I mean, I was still kind of, separating mind and brain, right? To me, dualism was just kind of like the default. I guess if you're kind of thinking in terms of like folk fill of mind, right? That's kind of like where most people start, I think. It's not super important.
Yeah, right, right. And I haven't read the stuff that Papineau's written, but no doubt he's right that this goes very deep in folk philosophy, and there are reasons we can explain the reasons, and some of them will have to do with wishful thinking about various things, but some of them will also have to do with kind of seductive theorizing, right?
Seductive theorizing. Hmm.
Seductive, right? As in um, the kind of thing that I was complaining about before. Sure, I mean, this kind of case, it seems like you could imagine that your brain just stopped working and you just went on as before, right? What does maybe? I mean, thought experiments of various kinds that you might use, as Descartes did, to try to motivate dualism.
Yeah, I guess it's just kind of not really taking seriously other views, right? It's just kind of relying on this intuition that dualism is plausible.
So I think that's right. Though, I mean, to be fair to the tradition, lots of people tried to give arguments for dualism of one kind or another. Substance dualism or attribute dualism, or in some cases, idealism, whatever.
Um, right. So there's this kind of broader idea then, I guess, right? Like psychophysical harmony is a specific argument for thinking that consciousness is kind of more expected on theism, but there's going to be kind of a broad, argument from consciousness, right? I guess by your lights, what are the what is the diagnosis by your lights of arguments like that?
So, well,
I guess it would.
you should be able to predict what I'm going to say now, right? Um, they the, if you think, as I do, that consciousness has somehow or other got just something to do with neural functioning, right? And then you're puzzling about consciousness. Presumably, that puzzle is answered if we can tell a satisfactory naturalistic evolutionary story about the appearance of consciousness in the universe. I mean, I'm going to assume for now what I think is plausible, that the only conscious things up until now have been organisms, evolved natural organisms. And there's, you might speculate about whether one day we'll have androids that are conscious. You might also, some people speculate about whether kind of you might have groups of things that are not individually conscious but collectively conscious, or that there are conscious things that when they get together and they make institutions or things like that, those things also have consciousness. Almost all of that, except for the stuff about androids, seems to me incredibly speculative, but I'm just going to stick with the only conscious things are organisms. We just have to be able to explain how they evolved and how we got to a point where there were, so say that there's the simplest the consciousness first appeared in a certain kind of worm, which had 3 layers of neurons, 100 or so neurons, or something like that. Then we just have to be able to tell a story about the evolution of that worm, and we're done, right? That's all that's left to explain.
I guess there's like a probabilistic impulse, maybe, right? Like maybe even if we can explain it, maybe it's still more expected on theism because, whatever story they'd like to tell.
Yeah. Okay. So when you say expected on theism, so let's try and unpack this a bit. We're thinking that there's a certain initial state of reality, and we're going to talk about how expected something is given that initial state, and if we think that there are laws governing and given the laws, because I think given the naturalistic initial state, given the necessary initial state, and then looking across the worlds, it wouldn't be too surprising if it turns out that almost all of them contain conscious organisms, so that consciousness is more or less certain on naturalism, right? On the other hand, if you think about theism and you think about a version where you want to say that God's omnipotent and God can make any kind of conceivable universe, there are going to be lots and lots of conceivable universes that don't have consciousness in them. And so it looks as though it might turn out to be less probable on theism that there'll be consciousness than on naturalism, given the versions of naturalism and theism that I'm thinking about. It's certainly not obvious that theism predicts consciousness. Now, there might be ways of getting around that, but it's not clear how, right? If we're going to say these are possible universes, and we're saying every possible universe, God exists of necessity and whatever exists is caused by God, then it's got to be that there are these possible worlds where God makes these universes that don't have consciousness in them. Right?
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're going to right. So now there's some kind of interesting questions there about omnipotence and so on.
Right. Yeah. So it is over an hour now, and we haven't gotten kicked out. So I guess we'll just see if it wants to kick us as we go. But so far, I guess we're all right. So,
well, if it does, you'll just send another link,
yep.
and we'll keep going.
I expected it to just kick us like a minute ago. We're at an hour and a minute, so all right, cool. You know, I mean, I'm not complaining. Let's see. So I guess that I'd like to think about some of the stuff you said about the mind and some of it. I'd like to return to it later, but I guess for now, that was kind of some of the main stuff that I was sort of wondering about, and I'm glad we got to flesh it out because like I said before, I felt personally like there wasn't enough time given when you kind of briefly touched on it before, so I'm glad I got to ask some of the questions. So there's some other stuff here, just kind of miscellanea, I guess. I was thinking about simplicity, right? Because if when you're talking about science or philosophy, parsimony is like a theoretical virtue, right? If you can kind of cut your costs without reducing explanatory power, that's a good thing. And it was interesting because I was reading a paper by Sean Carroll. I think it was called "Why Almost All Physicists Are Atheists" or something. I don't know, but he says a lot of the same things. He's like, well, look, if we compare, the best theistic model here to kind of my preferred naturalism, right? It turns out that my naturalism turns out to be simpler. And he made a comment. It was like one line. He just kind of buzzes over it. And I thought it was interesting. He says, I don't have any a priori arguments or considerations as to why this should be something that we, like in our theories. It just seems to me, in my experience as a scientist, that it's important. And I was thinking about it, and like, I don't know, that's kind of interesting, right? I mean, I thought surely there has to be some kind of a priori argument or consideration or something,
So I don't know whether this will count or not, right? It seems to me that if you show me that I can cut out some stuff, some of my commitments, without losing any of the things that I can explain, then I had no reason to believe in those things in the first place. And so if you're thinking about trying to make the best theory that you can, you should make a theory that just doesn't include them, right? So your theory will be there are all these things and that's it. And then there's, people might believe in other stuff, but from your perspective, you just don't think that there are such things because that was the form that your theory took. Now, that might just be restating the preference for simplicity. I'm not sure, but it feels like it's a reason, right? You now, but maybe it's not. Maybe we're kind of running together two things. Some people might say, well, surely wouldn't it be preferable to say this is my theory and then I'm just agnostic about whether there's more? I can't see any advantage in going that way. I think you should say this is my theory, and I think that's all there is.
Yeah, there's a sort of funny example from John Stuart Mill, I think. He says, if you can get away with explaining everything without, adding all the stuff, that's what you should do, because otherwise you end up sounding sort of silly, right? He gives the example of, like, if you explain somebody dying in a car crash, you don't need, an additional explanation of them having been poisoned that morning, right? The car crash is going to suffice. You just don't need the other thing.
Right. So we're explaining why they died.
Yeah.
Of course, if they had been poisoned in the morning, then it was just overdetermined. And we know, causal overdetermination does happen sometimes. But if you've got no reason to think that they were poisoned, it would be absurd to make it up as making really sure they were dead or something. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. So the next kind of miscellaneous thing, I guess, was I wanted to touch on miracles a little bit. So I was reading Elliot Sober. He did a review of a book talking about Hume on miracles, and his thing was called A Modest Proposal. And I think the book he was reviewing was written by Ehrman, something Ehrman.
Yep.
He's got this idea of Hume, though, where he's making this really grand claim where, because, he starts his essay by saying, if his argument is just, then it's a kind of eternal check on miracle claims. So it kind of gives this grandiose impression. And Sober wants to say, no, look, what Hume says, if you read the essay, is basically just that, miracles are basically just going to be things with really low prior probabilities, and you just need sufficiently strong evidence to overcome that. And if you read the essay, he talks about like 7 days of darkness or whatever, but he'd believe it if you have like several kind of well-regarded witnesses or whatever. He would believe it if he had sufficiently strong evidence. So I guess it sort of seems to me like that's kind of how you should read it. I don't know. I guess I was curious if you had an interpretation of that essay.
So we're now interpreting Hume or or Sober or Ehrman, but it's Hume. So Hume's in the inquiry, Hume's chapter on miracles has the way that people normally read it, there are two parts. There's this sort of a priori argument that that really you should never accept testimony to miracles, which rests on the idea that miracles have to have, it's not just low prior probability, but maximally low. They've got to be as unlikely as anything. And then Hume's thinking there's no way that you're going to be able to amass enough evidence to overcome that starting so low. And maybe Hume's wrong about that. And maybe in any case, you really don't want to think about miracles as being kind of maximally low probability. But Hume also has another bit, which is where he's kind of just talking in general terms about actual miracle claims and the reasons that we don't have for believing them. And he just makes the point that in general, the miracles of the religions are poorly attested. We have reasons for not trusting the reliability of the people making the claims, and so on. A bunch of considerations, which I think are kind of plausibly make the case that there aren't any good claims to miracles. Not that there couldn't be, but just that there haven't been. And I think that the in between bit that you were attributing to sober, that we should think that the right methodology here is you've got your prior probability, and then you just take the evidence as it comes in, and if the evidence is big enough, then you're going to accept the claim. Sure, that's true, but that ignores the kind of the second half of Hume's essay, which is that there's no miracle claim ever that's been made where anything like that circumstance happens.
Or I guess hasn't yet, right? Because I
Yeah,
guess,
yeah.
right, in principle it could.
Yeah, in
Which,
principle, but you also have a kind of inductive argument here. You know a lot about kind of the gullibility of people and the demands of religion and a whole lot of other things. It's kind of, and we've got a very long track record now,
yeah.
many thousands of years, and not one success. So what are the chances? We should be pretty confident, right? But as you say, and as Sober would say, there's no reason to think that the probability is zero. We should just think of it as epsilon, a small quantity, maybe one that we're
Yeah.
not prepared to say exactly how tiny it is, but it's very tiny.
I think Stephen Law makes pretty much the same point that you just made. Have you read his the X claim article? He has this thing, the X claim argument against religious belief, I think it's called.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, it's basically kind of the same point where an X claim is just some sort of supernatural claim, and the point is just that you should be skeptical about it because yeah, exactly, we have this really really bad track record about ghosts and spirits and witches and all sorts of stuff that we know are wrong, but we've got story after story after story of people still thinking that they've had experiences with these things. And so given that track record, that should sort of make you a little bit skeptical going forward.
right. But you don't want to overplay that either. You don't want to say that, so we've got certainty that there are no such things, right? That would be, you've got to give credence zero to this stuff.
Right.
Um, yeah.
So I also read Raymond Bradley's book, God's Gravediggers, and he
Yeah.
derived another argument from that essay. He calls it the contrariety thesis, and the idea is, I guess basically, if you kind of compare and contrast all the evidence for one religion against all the other religions, right? Because they all have their own stories. Say we've got Christian miracles on one side of the scale and all the other religious stories on the other side of the scale. Any particular religion is always going to be outweighed by the weight of all of the other miracles that contrast with it. And the idea is that they're kind of logically incompatible. And I guess I'm sort of interested in how, like, because the response you're going to get from people, I think it's Hick, right, who says that, like, actually they're not logically incompatible. Everyone who believes in God believes in the same thing. They've just kind of, I don't know, got like a slightly different conception or whatever, but they're all actually the same thing. And so if you want to take something like that, actually this kind of contrariety thesis just disappears.
There's another way you can get to that result too. So Kenny Pierce, in my debate book with him, says that all the other religions misperceive God. It's right. So there's a single God. Certain kinds of Christians are getting it pretty much exactly right, and then everybody else is getting it a bit wrong. Now, to that, I said it seems kind of weird to me to think that, for example, the Indigenous Australian beliefs about the rainbow serpent were misconceptions of the triune Christian God. That just seems not believable to me. Um,
Yeah. And the point.
and Hick's point, I mean, I want to go the same way. And for much the same sort of reason, that just doesn't sound like a credible claim.
Yeah.
to
The
me.
point Bradley made too was that it just kind of is in fact logically incompatible. He said if you're a Trinitarian, for example, that's not compatible with being a monotheist, or if you're like a polytheist, it's just they're different things, right? These are just logically incompatible things. Um, I guess to me that seems right, but I'm sure that there'd be pushback to that. But that was the point that he was trying to
Yeah,
make in that book.
right. So lots of the miracles of particular religions are specific to those religions, though. So the big miracles of Christianity are mostly about Jesus, and the Trinity. It's kind of central to that stuff, the way that most Christians think about it. If you think about the miracles attributed to the Prophet in Islam, they're very specific. The splitting the moon and various other things. Those are the destroying and opposing an army with a handful of dust and so on. Those things are very specific to Islam and actually are meant to, are sort of thought of, I won't say meant, are thought of as counting against competing religions, nearby competing religions. Right, so lots of Christians will say, well, the miracles of Christianity are so well authenticated, and the miracles of Islam and you know Buddhism and so on just aren't. That will be the reply.
Yeah. Um, so I was reading a paper of yours from I think almost 30 years ago at this point, so it's pretty old. So the question might sort of not ring a bell anymore, basically. But it was I don't even remember what it was called. But the point you were making was that people who it was talking about like Richard Dawkins in particular. He says that you couldn't be intellectually satisfied as an atheist until you had Charles Darwin come around and introduce evolution by natural selection, because then you didn't have an explanation of complex life. And the point you wanted to make was actually, well, I mean, we kind of did, right? I mean, you could explain it in several different ways, right? Maybe all the complexity was just explained sort of by complexity before that point, just kind of going back forever, right? Or whatever, right? However you wanted to do it. The point was you did have options, but there was one comment in particular that sort of interested me because you were talking about theory comparison a little bit, and you were worried about double counting, right? So you were worried about theists kind of double counting when they say that maybe theism is simpler. And then you made the comment that specifically I'm interested in. You said that God's creative actions are complex. So it's like they have just as much complexity to account for because of God's creative actions. And I guess I was sort of curious, what makes them complex, right? Because obviously you're going to have people who say, God himself is just totally simple and whatever.
Yeah. So I'm thinking. I I think what you're talking about is this. So let's suppose that there's an initial sheet of data, so that the universe begins with an initial surface, and there's a bunch of. I mean, you can think about it in David Lewis's terms. There's a bunch of parameters that characterize each point in this distribution, and if you change some of the values, you're going to get a different universe. Now, we have the particular universe that we did, right? There's a particular sheet. Why did we get that? There were lots and lots of other ones that we could have had there. Well, it's because God wanted this value to be that way, and he wanted this value to be that way, and he wanted this value to be that way, and so on across the whole thing, right? And so there's just as much complexity being taken for granted in the theistic view as there is in the naturalistic view. If the naturalist says, well, there's just this initial set of data, and these are all just fundamental posits. This values this, and this values that, and this values that. You don't escape that by postulating God. I mean, could try it out, right? Suppose there's a God. Now tell me, what were the distribution of values on that initial sheet of data? From the assumption that there's God, you can't answer that question, right? So you've got to put. I mean, one way of making the point is you've got to put all this information into your theory somewhere. You have to build it in, right? And so you don't get an advantage of simplicity for theism by thinking that there's a God, right? Your theory, in order to be adequate to explain the data, assuming that what you need is you need to have this initial distribution in the laws and you can explain everything else, we'll pretend that it's deterministic just to keep it simple, right? That was I think that's what you're talking about. That was the kind of point that I was making.
Yeah, and like I said, I think it's almost a 30-year-old paper at this point. So if it doesn't like immediately ring a bell, that's not that's pretty much to be expected, I think. But what you just said makes a lot of sense to me, because it's like, even if you just kind of accept as like brute, right? Like if you just say, look, complex life, right? You're right. I don't have an explanation, whatever. It's just brute, right? It's like, sort of superficially, I guess, it seems like theism has an explanation, right? But it's kind of like they're can kicking a little bit, right? Because it's like, how do you account for God's preference for this or that bit of
Yeah,
complex life or whatever? And it's like, unless you kind of put it in by hand, I guess it's not obvious that it's any better.
yeah. So right, so that is the point, right? Well, you have to bear in mind what needs explaining here, and then you have to make sure that your theory is up to explaining it. And your theory isn't just God exists, because you can try this out as an experiment. Write that down and now start deriving stuff from it and derive the current state of the world. Right? That's an impossible task.
Right.
Impossible.
Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I think I would agree. Um, so another thing I was reading recently was Duncan Pritchard had an article on recent work on radical skepticism, and the idea is that we've kind of got this triad of things, right? So we want to have knowledge, right? So then we also want to have a kind of epistemic closure principle, which just says, if you know something, then you know all of its denials, right? But then the third thing is that you want to say, or at least some people want to say, that you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, right? And so we have this kind of just never-ending problem of external world skepticism or whatever, because it's like we never seem to know that we're not brains in vats or whatever. Um, and so he went over some of the strategies with dealing with it and whatever. But I guess I was wondering, do you have like a strategy for dealing with that kind of radical skepticism?
So, I mean, I guess one thing is what you think you need for knowledge. Like, if you think you need certainty for knowledge, then maybe we'd be better off changing the topic slightly and just talking about what we believe and forget about knowledge. Um, I mean, these are kind of, there are other people who think that knowledge is the central epistemic notion. We should just start with that. Whereas I'm not inclined to believe that. I'm inclined to think that we should operate by talking about belief and what is reasonable to believe. And so there's that. I guess I give no credence to external world skepticism whatsoever. Right, I just don't give it any credence at all, and it doesn't bother me. I don't see it as a kind of serious competitor amongst the views that you might have. And why don't I think that it's a serious competitor? Because if you, I mean, it's yeah. You need a kind of weird view about the mind, I think. But what you're going to end up with is this view on which there's you and there's all this stuff happening in your mind, and it's just one thing after another, and there's nothing that explains any of it because there's nothing else, right? I mean, and as a theory, that's the most terrible theory. Nothing is getting explained. Whereas if you think that there's an external world, uh, you then have an explanation for all the stuff that's going on inside your head, right? It may be that, it certainly will be that you don't reduce the number of brutes that go unexplained to zero, but you reduce it a huge amount. And so it seems to me that you've got kind of overwhelming reason not to be an external world skeptic. That's the now I'm kind of alighting that kind of that do I know it question, because that just doesn't seem to me to be the interesting question. I've got overwhelming reason not to be, and that's enough.
So, what if I wanted to kind of build a model where, I don't know, there's my brain in a vat, and then everything is kind of super deterministic after that, such that everything that's happening in my brain or whatever is kind of determined by the state prior to it, right? And so actually everything does have an explanation because, if we're an identity theorist, then everything is kind of, you
Right.
know,
But the problem is that if we're identity theorists, we think that there's perceptual inputs and proprioceptive inputs. There's all kinds of inputs all the time, and you've just removed those, right? There's no. We're now supposing there's no light impacting on your retina. There's no breezes blowing on your skin, and so on, right? And so you don't you don't nobody thinks that your mind kind transitions from one state to another in the absence of inputs.
yeah.
Right. So that would be the problem with thinking about it that way.
Yeah, I suppose it would be. Um, so I was reading a little bit too about kind of nothingness, I guess, right? There's this kind of existential question by Leibniz, right? Why is there anything rather than nothing? And, on your view, it just turns out that, well, it's kind of necessary that there's something, right? Because there's not going to be any possible world where there's nothing, right? That's not going to be in the actual history. So it's just impossible.
Right. And that's the same thing the theist is going to say. Right. And most theists, maybe not all of them, maybe not Leibniz, but many of them think that God didn't have to create. So there are possible worlds where there's just God, nothing else. But there has to be at least God because God's necessary, right?
Right.
So it's the same answer.
There was this comment he makes though that I think is kind of interesting. He says we should expect nothing because it's simpler, right? What's simpler than nothing? And I guess I was sort of wondering if that's even true, because part of me is like, yeah, that makes sense, and part of me is like, well, I'm not sure that's actually right though, you know?
So so I don't think that we should have any expectations about um, any prior expectations, that is, prior to all experience, about the complexity of the world. It's not that a simple world is more likely than a complex world. I don't think. Um, the simplicity is an important consideration when it comes to theory choice, right? We've got this data. Well, now what's the simplest theory that can explain the data, right? Um, but this is not a priori intuition that the world is simple. That's just not what it is, right? It's rather the thing that we talked about before, that you've got no, if you don't have some reason to believe in stuff, you cut it out, you throw it away. But your theory is as complicated as it has to be in order to accommodate all the data. That's my hunch. So we don't. It's not that we have an a priori intuition that favours a simple world. We have a sort of a natural preference for the simplest theory that's consistent with all the data.
Yeah. Um, Peter Van Inwagen made an argument too that I found interesting. He says, look, if you're going to kind of just imagine all these possible worlds, right? And I guess we're just taking for granted here that conceivability is going to be roughly equivalent to possibility. There's only one world where we have nothing. So it turns out that actually it's going to be extraordinarily unlikely. And I guess I was curious if you thought that was, interesting or like a good argument.
So So as you pointed out, it depends what we think about the conceivability, the connection between conceivability and possibility. I just want to sever that link altogether. Um, but suppose you didn't, right? Um, if you really think that conceivability is a guide to possibility and we imagine that we can conceive entire possible worlds, then Van Inwagen's right. I think there's only one empty world, if that's a world, if that counts as a world at all, because you might think that it doesn't, that the possible world's got to have something. It's got to have something in it. Um, right.
Yeah.
I mean, there are arguments. Um, for example, there's an argument for the conceivability of the empty world. Imagine a world with 10 things and gradually start subtracting them. When you get down to the last one and you subtract it, there you are at the empty world. I'm kind of skeptical about that argument, but I don't have a particular stake in it because I don't buy this stuff about conceivability, the link between conceivability and possibility in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're kind of winding down here. I think we're down to the last three kind of things here. So the last thing from me, I got input from other people who just kind of wanted to ask some things. I figured it'd be kind of cool just to let other people, ask some stuff too. I didn't kind of want to hog it all, I guess. But the last thing from me was about existential inertia. So the idea is basically there's different accounts, and so just I'm going to ignore kind of different accounts and just say that the gist is things persist unless they're kind of acted upon by sufficiently destructive forces to remove them, right? So um, I was Joe Schmid has this blog post called "So You Think You Understand Existential Inertia." I read through all of that, and there was one thing that was really interesting. He points out that if you're gonna make this kind of if you're gonna have this kind of theory, you have to clarify its scope because you're gonna run into debates about like universals, right? Because if you say that things are not dependent, just kind of full stop, right? Maybe that's false if you believe in universals, because things are in fact going to depend in some sense on universals. So it's like maybe you want to characterize your theory as saying that they persist absent sufficient destructive forces from other concrete objects, right? I guess I was curious how you sort of, I don't know, if you think there's a useful way to sort out the scope of an existential inertia theory that maybe avoids problems with universals and whatever.
Okay, so I'm not familiar with the blog post. Joe and Dan Linford wrote a book about this that they published with Springer, which I reviewed. So I've read the book. I really enjoyed it. And they canvass a whole lot of different formulations of theses of existential inertia. And I I mean, a kind of short answer to your question is I'm quite happy to be a nominalist, so I don't want to accept universals anyway, and so I'm not going to feel the force of exactly that formulation of the problem. Uh, I'm pretty confident that you can make it. I mean, they offer 7 or 8 different formulations of existential inertia, as I recall. One of which is similar to the one I had in my initial paper when I criticised what Fazer had to say about the Aristotelian argument. And I don't think that there's a big worry there. That will be my short response.
So if for you, it's probably not a big deal, right? I mean, I think that you can work around it as a nominalist, no problem. But I guess it's like, are you at all interested in trying to, put the scope in such a way that gets around such things in case you're talking or like trying
Yeah,
to,
yeah,
yeah,
right. So what you said seemed okay, right? We if we accept that things are Well, depends on the kind of notion of dependence here. Uh, maybe what you don't want to do is start talking about independence if you have this idea that things are composites of um, essence and existence, or whatever your particular view is. Um, but the but the if we're going to allow ourselves to talk about external destructive forces or something like that, that puts us in a certain ballpark where we're not worrying about, I think, um, anything other than the actions of external objects of various kinds. So, particular example, the chair. When I leave the room, close the door, the table in my room just goes on existing unless it gets vaporized by a Martian ray or something like that. Right? There's a excluding circumstances thing, and that seems fine. Right? That it'll just go on existing unless, and then you point to some circumscribed, though you can't fill out the list, but some circumscribed actions of objects of various kinds in the world. And that seems enough, right? So it doesn't seem as though you need to worry about the fact that if it's a fact that the table is somehow a composite of um, universals and maybe bare particular, whatever the particular metaphysics is that you're accepting.
Hmm. I think that's something I just kind of sit down and think about some more. There was something that is now. Oh wait, no. So there's going to be this deeper question again, right? People are going to question, um, like why is reality such that things have existential inertia, right? And I think, for you, it's gonna be necessary, right?
Right. So um, I think that's right. The kind of principle is that, um, the general principle is things go on existing unless something stops them from existing. Think about the universe. There's nothing external to the universe, so there's nothing external to the universe that can stop it from existing, can cause it to stop existing. Maybe there could become internal factors. So maybe the universe could stop expanding and contract and then just disappear, right, in a big crunch. But to keep this conversation simple, let's imagine that the universe is going to go on expanding. Then there isn't any external thing that can undo it, right?
Right. Um, yeah. So I guess minus like that's pretty simple. I guess I do want to sit down and think some more about the earlier comments. But so moving on then to kind of the last bit here was just input from people that were not me. So these last couple of questions are just from people that I was like, hey, here's what I'm up to. Do you guys want to ask questions? And so that's what this is. So the
Yeah.
first question was, a couple of us are really interested in animal ethics, and so it's very, very common to hear people say that, um, animals just are, maybe less important is one way of putting it, or that they are just kind of outside the realm of moral agency, or just however people feel like framing it, I guess, because they don't have a kind of thoroughly robust moral sense like we do. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest it's kind of rudimentary, right? Like animals will have kind of senses of empathy towards one another or whatever. But um, the idea, right, that animals are somehow kind of less morally relevant or important or whatever because they lack a kind of thoroughly robust morality. Do you think it goes anywhere? Do you think it's like worth anything?
So, and I guess there's two things to disentangle here. One is about whether animals deserve moral consideration. That is, whether we should give them moral consideration. And then there's a different question about the extent to which animals themselves are moral agents, whether they're that are capable of moral deliberation and so on. And there's a fair amount of evidence, I think, in study of chimpanzees, for example, that there's more than rudimentary moral sense amongst them. But maybe you don't have to go very far down into the animal kingdom before you start thinking that animals are not moral agents, right? As you said, maybe empathy goes down further than I'm allowing at the moment, and I'm not saying how far down it does go because I don't really know. That's one set of questions, but then there's this other set of questions about the moral consideration that we should give to animals, which is largely independent of that first question, unless you think that the only things that are deserving of moral consideration are things that are themselves moral agents, and I don't buy that at all.
Yeah. So I guess just to get a sense of kind of, what you would go for, Peter Singer obviously, like, really famously, right, has this kind of argument, if you think that, say, an animal test is inhumane for humans, and you compare, say, because it's, like, I don't know, painful, right? And then you think about, an animal who has similar kind of pain capacities. You should think that it's also just as bad as them, right? So that's going to disallow, certain experiments on, like, rats, for instance, which people are going to generally say, yeah, I don't care, do whatever you want to a rat. Do you kind of like that kind of Peter Singer idea there, or do you think about it kind of differently?
So I think I'm on Singer's side there. I don't think that we should be causing pain to other human beings, and I also don't think that we should be causing pain to animals as well. Now, this has fairly radical consequences. So it has radical consequences for farming, but it also has radical consequences for the way that lots of people amuse themselves with horse racing and hunting and all kinds of things like that. I mean, there are questions about about how far down the capacity to experience pain goes. But as I kind of hinted earlier, I think it goes very low. So even nematodes can feel pain, I think. And so that's kind of demanding and would require, for most people, radical revisions of practice that they wouldn't be prepared to make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the kind of last thing then is something that a lot of people were really interested in. About half the people that I asked the exact same question, which was, is religion, even if you think it's not true, is it kind of socially useful? Is it kind of a good in society?
So that's not a question that's going to have a yes, no answer, I don't think. I think it's a complicated matter. So there are religious institutions that do lots of harm. Sometimes the very same religious institutions also do quite a lot of good. Now, you might wonder whether the religion part is essential to the good doing. So I'm thinking, for example, that in lots of countries, this is certainly true. In Australia, lots of hospitals are actually run by religious organisations. And there's no doubt that a lot of the work of those hospitals is good. Now, beyond that, I like lots of things. I mean, government would be another example. Religion's a mixed bag, right? So I'm not one of the people who thinks. I mean, I also, it's kind of if say the Australian government was to declare religion illegal, unconstitutional, un-Australian tomorrow, that would be so counterproductive. Right? There's no, I mean, there's no serious possibility that that would happen. But lots of the in my view anyway, lots of religion is pretty benign. It doesn't have particularly bad consequences. And there's no particular reason to worry about it. There are exceptions to this. Um, Not all religion is benign, but lots of it is. And this kind of separates me from more strident critics of religion, of whom there have been many over the last few hundred years, who've often seen religion as the root of all social evil and so on. But I'm not inclined to agree with that.
Yeah, I guess it's not the same question, but very, very closely related, I guess. I mean, do you think it'll ever kind of go away, or do you think there's because I was reading this thing by Kai Nielsen, and do you know about Kai Nielsen?
Yeah.
Right. So he was writing about it, and he was writing about it from an analytic Marxist perspective, and so he was going over a little bit about how he was writing about the opium of the people thing, and he's like, I think that it's right to point out that there's kind of this intractable thing where like why do some people at least believe in religion? And he's like, well, look, some people like the thought of the afterlife because they don't want to die, and to a lot of people naturalism just doesn't have what they're looking for, and so there's this kind of intractable thing that some people are always going to have to some kind of religious or supernatural thing because they want an afterlife or whatever.
So it's not just afterlife. There's a bunch of things that um, religion offers as part of a kind of package. So, at least the way that I think about religion, and putting it very crudely, one important part of it is belief in the supernatural agents or supernatural structures like karma and so on. And another part of it is that if you're religious, you think of there being certain demands put upon you by these things. So there's certain things you're expected to do in the course of your life in order to live well. And part of the payoff is that you then get promises or actual assistance with some of the things that make life hard. So there's death, but there's also injustice and loneliness and a bunch of other things. And then there's a fourth thing, which is that all of these things, the first three things, sort of come together in public congregation or something like that. So there are kind of rituals and that whole thing about sort of socializing with people and singing together and all that kind of stuff is actually one of the good things in life. And so there's this package that overall certainly has its attractions. And it's pretty... so I'm agreeing with the kind of maybe the gist of what Nielsen's saying, but I do think the story's a bit more complicated than the one that you told.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree. I was just sort of trying to
Yeah,
get it across.
yeah.
So I guess basically like a really did you read I think it was what's her name? Ion Hersiali. She was apparently a big new atheist, and she wrote very recently "Why I Am Now a Christian," and one of the lines stood out to me because a lot of it, I guess, I didn't really like very much. Um, she said that she was kind of converting more for like political reasons. It seemed like to me. But because she says we need Christianity to like defeat wokeness and imperialism and whatever. So I don't know. I thought that was a bit weird. But one particular line, I guess, she said that religion has this unifying story, and that's very, very powerful, and that's something that we kind of need, is this kind of unifying story. And I guess personally, I'm sort of not really impressed with that. But it sounds like maybe you think that a lot of people are kind of more impressed with that.
So religions in the plural don't have a unifying story, they have a dividing story. Um, there's a kind of, and it's been a, what part of the story that I didn't tell is that there's kind of in group, out group marking for religion. So people in particular religions dress in distinctive ways and behave in distinctive ways that enable them to tell who's in and who's out. If we wanted unification, religion would not be the way to go because there's no obvious way in which a decision is going to be made. Is it going to be Hinduism that we unify on? Is it going to be Australian Indigenous beliefs or what?
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting point because it's like she wants to say, look, we need a unifying story, but then it's like counterpoint, the stories are divisive, all of them. So I guess that is interesting. Um, yeah, I guess that's about all I had, and we're coming up on about 2 hours. So that I guess I wasn't sure how long we were going to go, but 2 hours is pretty decent. Um,
Yeah, I normally after about 90 minutes, I start kind of losing the plot and start saying very loopy things so you can check the tape and see how bad it got.
I thought it was pretty good. I thought the whole thing was pretty good. I'm glad I got through everything. I was sort of worried that I'd be running too long, but no, I'm very happy with how that turned out. So I guess if you didn't have anything else, that's pretty much it.